So, welcome back from lunch. I hope everybody had a filling lunch and good conversations. We're moving into our afternoon program, and between now and our coffee break, we have a panel which we're about to start, and then another round of lightning talks. And the panel that we are about to start is on imposter participants in HCI research. I'm going to be the moderator, so we're just going to jump right into it. And why don't we have the panel start by introducing themselves briefly? And why don't we just do introductions and then we'll kind of jump into personal experience so that you can all build off of each other. Yeah, Sam, why don't you start?
Hi everyone, I'm Sam Martocci. I'm from the IRB. I'm an IRB specialist. My focus is on education and improvement, but I also review initial applications, and I'm here looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say about imposter participants.
Hello, I'm Wen Tao. I am a third-year PhD student in computer science. I work with Michelle Masaryk in the SP2 lab.
Hello, I'm Sonia Park. I just finished my fourth year. I study HCI and usable privacy and security.
Hi everyone, I'm Jian Zheng. I'm finishing my fourth year as a PhD student. I work on digital well-being and more specifically problematic smartphone usage. My advisor is Yongkin Choi.
Thank you all. And so why don't we just jump right in to talk about any experiences you have with fraudulent participants. And I wonder, Sonia, maybe if you could start, because this was your idea, and you can talk a little bit about how you even thought this would be a good panel to talk about it in this space.
So I mainly do qualitative research, for example, interviews, focus groups, conducting them online, especially because I started my PhD in 2020, which means all of my studies were remote. I think it was in my second year, we have a milestone where we need to conduct independent research, and I was conducting research about cohabitating adults using smart home devices together. And while I was conducting that research, I had a lot of fake participants. So either, faking their eligibility or faking their experiences. It was quite a lot. It was like 4 out of 30 participants, which is quite significant. And I think I was talking about my research to my, friends, colleagues, and presenting it at in smaller venues, and I realized it's not just my issue. Like, a lot of people actually go through this, and actually there's been a recent call for attention for those who have attended CHI this year. There was a paper workshop session about fraudulent participants, so that's why I wanted to bring it up here and share our experiences. Yeah.
Great. Others want to share kind of if they've run into this or what this has looked like in their own work, or in Sam's case, if you've had to navigate this at all in terms of IRB's roles.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in quickly about the IRB's experience. Mostly our experience with fraudulent participants has been related to survey research. Obviously here we're focused on qualitative research, but there are still safeguards that you can build into your project, and we'll get to those, but our experience has mostly been related to surveys.
Yeah, my experience was I was in my first year. I had done work previously on kind of the social dimension of deepfakes and manipulated images, so I was trying to do a research project where we were trying to actually interview people who had had images and videos manipulated without their consent. And yeah, for this one, we also we tried to. One of the ways that we were trying to recruit participants was just like online. We tried posting kind of like a screening survey ad on the UMD Reddit, and we kind of got a whole deluge of signups, about 10 per hour starting at 3 a.m. And we were obviously suspicious that like many of these were probably not real, but we decided to give it a try anyway. And so we conducted one interview and decided ultimately that we were not comfortable kind of adjudicating whether whether participants were going to be like fraudulent or truthful. And so I'm kind of here to present, in some ways, the pessimistic take. We ended up not actually finishing that project due to this and some other issues as well.
For me, so I was doing my IP integrator paper in my second year. My study is about, maybe some of you know it, is waiting time activities. What do people do while waiting? My criteria for participants is kind of loose, that you need to be 18 years old or older, located in the United States, speaking English, and using an Android phone. Now, first I started recruiting through Prolific, and those participants are real. And I didn't have enough participants signing up, so I posted that information on a Facebook group, and then I got a lot of participants. And when I doing interview with them, I found some of them speaking a quite different English that I cannot understand. But I think maybe that is my fault. I'm not a native speaker, so I cannot understand everyone's English. And then later, because, well, my study is a mixed method study. I do interview, I also ask them to report something through their phone. So through their phone tracking data, I noticed their time zone seems not right. They are always active during the night, but inactive during the daytime. So I think maybe there's something wrong. And then I checked their location because I collected the data through a sign-up survey through Qualtrics. So Qualtrics provided this IP address and also location. I check their IP address and location and see they are actually not located in the United States. So they cannot be my participants. And then I figure out, okay, they are actually trying to fake their identities. Yeah, that's my story.
So John just shared, kind of details of like red flags or things that stood out. Did other things stood out to you in terms of just really made you question, is this person actually a legit participant? I mean, because I know it's not always clear and you want to give them the benefit of the doubt. So can you talk a little bit more about like red flags or other factors that kind of make you think that you might have a fraudulent or imposter participant?
I can go first. So I also have screener surveys to, sort out eligibility of our participants. And one of that is asking them to provide their names, email addresses so I can contact them. Very obvious fake participants are, their names are kind of, odd, or their emails are very generic. I can see that they're generated very hastily, xyz123@gmail.com, something like that. So those are red flags that you can actually screen in the survey. More difficult is when they actually meet the criterias, but then you cannot tell unless you actually conduct an interview and then talk to them. The red flags that I've seen in my research was that the participant had to move the location while they were doing the interview. And I think on the camera, I saw that the location was totally different. I could tell it's not in the US, while my study was based in the US. So I was like, okay, that's kind of odd. Or my participant had to, it was a group interview with cohabitating adults, and their stories didn't line up. Among themselves. Their stories didn't line up with their survey entry. Those are all red flags. And one of the activities that was required during my interview was they had to draw something. It was about their mental models of how smart home technologies work. And some of the participants, during the interview, they didn't want to put the camera on when they're drawing. So okay, maybe you're shy. But then after, when they are presenting their drawings, they were I could tell they were very generic drawings that was pulled out from the internet. So that was a red flag for me. But, I had to collect my own data, my sense about what are the red flags, and building up to the conclusion that this is fake was a pretty long, involving process.
Yeah, so my experience is a little bit different. For our study, we were trying to recruit people with very specific and somewhat rare experiences. And so we had put out this post on Reddit as just kind of an initial feeler, like a first attempt, like a very, very first attempt at recruitment. And so when we got 60 signups starting at 3 a.m., we were immediately suspicious. And we kind of assumed that most of these people were probably fraudulent participants. I talked to my advisor about it, and the advice that I got was, right, like, so they've responded to your screening survey, sure, but it seems pretty unlikely that fraudulent participants are going to actually show up to an interview. And if they do, like, it should probably be pretty easy to tell them apart. And I think my experience was, like, maybe that was true earlier, but I don't think that's really a safe assumption that you can make these days. Because pretty much in the one interview that I conducted, where we picked someone that we thought might actually be a real participant, there was no red flag, essentially. Like, I had a collaborator with me on the interview, and afterwards we turned to one another and we were like, if they were lying, then they're a really, really good actor. Like, there was no telltale anything. There was one thing where I asked, so how did you hear about this study? And they said Craigslist. And I was like, oh, well, that's definitely not how you heard about this study. But, if they had like done their due diligence to just look at where we had posted or know something about where we had posted the study, then they could have answered that question accurately. And so, yeah, there really was no obvious red flag for us.
For my study, the red flags, first is I mentioned the very strange accent I cannot understand. Second, I see some of the participants, they're sharing a laptop using different Zoom accounts. So for example, I have, say, Alex signed up for yesterday's interview. I already completed that interview. And for today's interview, I see that name join my Zoom waiting room again briefly, and then we quit, and then sign in again with another name. So I asked, are you living together with this Alex? And the participant would say, no, I don't know that name. But I see that happened a lot. So I think maybe they share a laptop, they live together. There's something they don't want to admit. So I think maybe they're not real.
So I know Wentel mentioned that you just didn't continue with the study, but how was this resolved in other cases? Yeah, and Wental, how long did you continue? Did you just were you just like, no, we can't figure it out. We're just gonna.
Yeah. So we figured that the problem, I mean, a lot of the problem was like the core of the problem was the incentive, right? Like, people are trying to participate fraudulently in our interviews because they want the monetary incentive that we were providing. And so we ended up trying to pivot to like, okay, so instead of paying participants, we're going to like make a donation to a relevant like nonprofit in their name. And there are rules at UMD that basically don't allow this. So we tried two things. We tried to talk to like people at UMD who could get that to work for us. It took a long time to hear back, and that was ultimately unsuccessful. We also tried to do recruitment through like kind of more partner organizations, reaching out to relevant organizations that could point us to people to interview, and ultimately just didn't really like have success that way either. So because we somewhat exhausted both of those options, we just didn't continue with the study.
For me, my study ran for 2 weeks. When I realized finally I can confirm they are not in the United States by checking their location and IP address, I already completed like maybe 5 participants. I already paid 2 of those that are not really in the United States. So I sent out those participants who I suspect were not in the United States, send them an email saying that I'm sorry, I have to pass the study because of some technical issue. and then I never resumed the study with them again. And I paid 2 participants fully and several more for their first week of data collection, and then canceled all the appointments with the future imposter participants. But I cannot use the data for the 2 completed and the several half-completed participants.
Sam, does the IRB have any advice for how to navigate this? If we assume that fraudulent participants are largely motivated by the incentive, like, and Wental mentioned like one of the challenges was kind of like what the rules are. So I'm sure the IRB has had conversations with more than just Wental's group in this. So I don't know if you have anything you want to share.
Yeah, so the best thing you can do is before you start your study, build in some safeguards so that you don't have to compensate fraudulent participants. So you can use some template language that we have. Any suspected fraud or abuse will result in forfeiture of compensation. Essentially, if we think you're not real, we don't have to compensate you. You can include that in the consent form. You can include that in your Part 2 application. And then once you start to build up the evidence that all the other panelists have discussed, and you document that evidence, you do not need to compensate fraudulent participants. They supposedly read the consent form and they agreed to it, so they should. You are able to adhere to that. So that's beforehand. There's also other things you can do. Other people have mentioned collecting IP addresses. If you're doing interviews, you could require that the participants turn on their camera, before the interview begins, like before you start recording, something like that, just to make sure you're not interviewing the same person over and over, because I've certainly heard of that happening. So once you have, a combination of reasons to exclude a participant, as long as they're documented and you have that language in your approved application, you're good to not compensate them. If you don't have that text in your project and you believe you have fraudulent participants, you should contact the IRB as soon as possible, and you can add in that language via an amendment as soon as possible as well.
So much of HCI research involves users. So the work that you all are doing is very typical of HCI work. So what do you all have concerns based on your personal experiences about the quality or future research in this field?
Definitely, yeah. I think it should be more of a norm for, people to think about this ahead of time, which is hard to say retroactively if it's easy to say that once you run into it. But I think it should be more of a norm to address this in methods and limitations. In cases where fraudulent participants could have been part of your study, talk about whether you think that was an issue and why, and what you did to kind of keep an eye out for that. I've reviewed papers also where we just had, the results were not really believable based on what we knew about our understanding of the world and of how many people are using cutting edge security technologies, for instance. And so I think it's definitely an issue, and I think we need a lot more awareness and kind of norm building around just targeted at making people aware at a baseline that fraud is not just an issue that impacts quantitative research, which a lot of people think about, but also it's an issue for qualitative research too.
I think there are layers, but since it happened in my early PhD years, I think when it happened, I had kind of a crisis moment, thinking I mainly do qualitative research, but if I get fraudulent participants and I'm, interacting with them online, face to face, how can we trust survey data? How can we trust, any other quantitative research data? I had a whole identity crisis. How do we believe that what we know? I just went through that moment when I faced fake participants.
Yeah, I was going through one around the same time, in which I was like, we can't believe any data anymore because we were just having so many trouble. We were having, because Sonia's been working with me for 4 years, and we had problems on most projects that we were in. And I was having problems with Qualtrics, their built-in survey participants, with over 50% of them having to be removed for being,
We had like 90.
90% in the Google form one. Yeah. We had 90% were what Sonia was saying with like, they were all following this very predictable pattern with, they entered their first name, their last name, their email was first name, last name, and then a string of 5 random characters. And so that became very, very obvious, especially as you went through 900 rows. But yeah, I mean, it really does scare me about a lot of the research we do. And if people aren't getting sufficient training, if they don't know how big of an issue this is, the publisher perish mentality of I just need to get that work out and get it published. Like I have serious concerns, not just for HCI, this is for folks doing empirical work in general, but obviously we're thinking about it from the HCI perspective. Why don't we pause to see if the audience has any questions, comments, experiences? I'm going to grab my.
Thank you so much. And I want to say, Sam, thank you because you helped me out of a bind when I had fraudulent responses to a survey, like within minutes. I was like, Sam, the IRB, freak out. What do you do? Do we have to pay people who clearly are, fraudulently responding to the survey? So, thank you. You're not alone. And a couple of things that helped me that were just totally serendipitous or lucky for this study. And my student Mace is going to be talking about our study later and may briefly touch on this survey mini debacle. We were encouraged by IRB to put in an attention checker question. So we had people type avocado. So in case it was actually bot generated, that might be something where it would flummox people's system setup because it would involve typing. And the other thing, and again, this is kind of luck based on the subject area, was I knew a lot about the systems, institutions, and the things that I was asking about. So that's great if you're doing research in an area that you've been deeply embedded in, but much harder if it's like kind of a new frontier and we don't know a lot. But I think putting in a question to which you know the answer and that your participants, if they've really had, whatever the relevant experience. So like it could be like a type of tool that one might use, but that maybe somebody wouldn't be able to just like super easily generate with a Google search, can be a good way of serving as kind of an equivalent of an attention checker, because we got a whole bunch of survey responses really quickly, and my response naively was like, oh, the research is really needed. It's really moving people. It's really connecting with them. And it was like, no, they're just like typing garbage. But I could see that it was garbage based on their responses. So.
Thank you for that. I'm so glad we were able to help. Yeah, we're obviously available if you have any issues like that. But yes, I think those are really great ideas. In surveys, I know it's very important to use those attention checks, obviously making sure that they're fair and that you have those stipulations built into your project. But I do agree that asking some kind of, not necessarily basic question, but some sort of question to verify that the respondents do know what they're talking about for a qualitative study could be a really good method to verify participation.
The Pew Research Center just did released about this, in which in one of their surveys, kind of as an attention check, I don't know if that was initially the plan, they asked a question about like if you had experience with some basically like nuclear submarine technology, and they found that this is something that like a very small fraction of a percentage of the world population would have, and like they found that young people way overrepresenting like 25%, and like certain demographics were, and it was good to see Pew doing that because they are so well known for their survey design. But that's another thing you could check out.
I was wondering if you all have any thoughts or advice or considerations of like companies you can go to ask for participants. It's like my initial concern is a lot of this is because we're all trying to do the same thing, which is maybe like we just don't have time to put in the level of effort necessary to do like verification. Whereas, YouGov and these places certainly do that. But we don't always need we don't always need survey responses. We want people to actually like interview. Is there a resource, like a company or organization you would go to get participants like that who have done this sort of identity verification for you?
As far as I'm aware, I mean, there's like the Qualtrics panels, there's all these different like panel research opportunities, though I'm not sure that they always have the people that you're looking for, right? They could be a really specific set of individuals. We kind of discussed earlier, they could be like those professional research participants, people who just do these kinds of studies to make a living, and how valid are those responses? That can be kind of an issue. So that could be one approach, but other than that, I haven't really heard of much, using a company to verify. I know some people have tried requiring someone to show like an identification document, so like a driver's license, but that has been challenging, I think, for a lot of individuals on campus.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the study. I think because qualitative studies often have relatively small samples, I think it's reasonable to, even if there isn't like a generic organization that does that kind of a service, I feel like often there is some kind of like you can find an organization or a small network that you can more or less trust that suits the needs of your study. All of the studies that I've done since have been kind of focused on specific groups of professionals, so I'm especially in that boat. But I would imagine that if you're trying to target more generic users, but location isn't super important, like you could probably find local groups, even just like a random group in like the city that you're in, and like maybe people from that could serve as reasonable participants. I don't know.
So I just wanted to pick up on the Pew report and mention that they found that it was 12% of U.S. adults claimed that they had a license to operate a class SSGN submarine. And in reality, the true population percentage rounds to 0. So that, in a way, it was an attention check. But I wanted to mention two things that I think have come out from these Pew reports that are interesting, and this is, I guess, more of a comment than a question. But one is, I think the recruitment mechanism matters a lot. So I think this is implicit in the conversation, but opt-in panels where people can self-select into the panel seems to be the online panels that are the most problematic. So I think in Pew reports, they're seeing that it's 7% or more of those panels are now bogus respondents, and it's across all the opt-in panels they're checking. So this is, in a way, I mean, the panel discussion is so helpful because I was thinking, well, this is a new reality. I remember a few years ago we were surprised when we saw this, and now it almost seems like this is what we have to anticipate if we're using an opt-in panel. But so there are probability panels. Understanding America is one out of University of Southern California. There's Amerispeak. So these send out letters, or they knock on doors and recruit people. And in Pew's research, there's the percent of fraudulent respondents in those panels is less than 1%. So I think, but they're so much more expensive. So I just want to make that distinction because, when thinking about empirical research, it's like, well, can we trust it? It's like, well, let's carefully read the methodology and see, are these opt-in panels or are these probability panels? I think that's one. But then I was just going to say, one of the things that comes out of these reports, which I never would have thought of, is they said that if the true population proportion is around 50%, they're seeing that the fake responding doesn't matter very much because it's generating a lot of random error. Because the people who are going through the survey are just saying yes or no. But I think you had mentioned when you're asking people about something rare, like using these cutting edge technology, if the respondent is then randomly selecting yes or no, it biases the results in a substantial way, like with the submarine example going from 0 to 12, or in your case. So I think that's another way, if you're doing quant research, to think like, okay, what's the actual population percentage? And if you start from there, you know maybe what the impact of this will be. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about adding questions to like a screener or something like that. I know Sonia, when in our recent Airbnb work that you presented, we tried to verify that they were an actual Airbnb host before interviewing them. I don't know if you ran into any issues with that you want to talk about, but like other ways that you've been thinking about that we haven't talked about yet in terms of like trying your hardest to actually identify and prevent fraudulent participants.
Yeah, kind of answering Cody's question. I think I'm becoming the expert in like detecting fraud. But yeah, for the Airbnb project that I just presented, we had a very robust verification process before and during the interview. So before we asked for their profiles, we cross-checked the profile information and pictures with emails. Also during the interview, we checked between survey, and also we sent a message on their profile for them to check if they got the message. And actually during that process, a lot of people just like, I'm not gonna, it's not worth it. I'm not gonna do it. So we lost a lot of participants. Another issue that we actually wanted to raise was like, so I know that IRB, we can write like, if we decide that it's fraud, we don't have to pay you. But ultimately the burden of proof is on us, and we also have biases and just ethical implications of like how our biases can be reinforced while we are deciding who are fake and who are real.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to that. Like, we've talked a bunch about different strategies for detecting and preventing fraudulent participants in qualitative research, which I think are, given the situation that we're in, kind of pragmatic and necessary. But you can also see how, like, they might like be like methodologically speaking, right? Like people from a privacy perspective might not be comfortable with some of these. You might be kind of like giving like following unconscious biases, right? If you're discriminating by accents, you might be there's kind of a normative bias also, where like if you're saying, well, this kind of experience is really rare, it seems really improbable, then you're going to miss out on the rare case where legitimately someone has an unusual experience. So I think there's a huge like methodological problem in like how do we actually do this pragmatically necessary but methodologically problematic task of detecting fraud.
I just have a little to add that I would feel uncomfortable to confront those people saying that, okay, we detect you are imposter and we are not going to pay you. So I would feel very uncomfortable sending that email. Maybe.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, power dynamics, but also just kind of like, it can be hard to have those conversations. I've had people on Mechanical Turk before be like, I'm going to reach out to your IRB. And I'm like, reply, CC Joe Smith. And I'm like, no worries, I'll do it. Here's Joe Smith.
Yeah, and that's also why I mentioned to have documentation of why you believe this person is fraudulent, because then if they contact us and say, this PI is not paying me, we'll contact you and say, like, just FYI, this person's contacted us, and you can come back and say, these are the 3 reasons I don't think they're real, and we'll say, yeah, we agree, like, sounds good, we're not going to reply to them, essentially. People can get a little hostile, so, just be careful with that. Yeah. You don't need to deal with that. That's not your responsibility.
And if you're a student and you run into this, like, go to your advisor. Like, they probably have been through some variation of that in the past, and like, don't feel like you need to take it on, or reach out to the IRB and they can give you good guidance. But we're almost out of time, so I just like 2 minutes left. If anybody has final thoughts or things that you've been thinking about related to this topic you want to leave the audience with.
Actually, I've been thinking about this topic. Yesterday, my daughter was watching cartoon. There's one episode title is "Beware of AI Swiping Face." So I think this could happen to our like online interview. How if I like using face swiping software and change my voice and pretending to be another, say I'm a female, I'm maybe older adults. How can we tell apart that they are not real? Are there any technical use? And I'm thinking even going a step further, then maybe there's no real person sitting behind that camera. That's all AI generated. How can we tell them apart?
I also wanted to add about like researchers' well-being, because I mean, it happened in our first year, second year. So when you're earlier career, junior researchers, this happens, and you kind of put it on yourself, and you go through, you know, phases of imposter syndrome, or like you think it's your fault. So maybe creating support groups, connecting with senior level researchers or advisors who've been through this. I think it's an important step for for the community.
I think the last thing I'll add is just that we've talked a bunch about how it can be difficult to detect and prevent imposter participants. I think there's also a dimension that was especially present in my work where I was uncomfortable in kind of like the positionality of having to adjudicate who was telling the truth or not, because our research topic was kind of sensitive. It was manipulated images and videos. And we were trying to talk to participants where like they had potentially traumatic experiences related to whether people believe them or not. And I think depending on the kind of research questions that you have and the kind of research topic that you're dealing with, like this is also a dimension to just at least consider that, like, even if you feel like you can somewhat effectively determine who's telling the truth or not, that may or may not like ethically be something that you're okay with doing. So.
I'll just add that it is ultimately a judgment call, which makes it very difficult. But just gather as much evidence as possible, talk it through with your advisor, and then you can also always talk to the IRB.
Okay, well, let's thank our panelists for a great discussion.